Hello friends, this video on direct and indirect object part 1 is brought to you by ExamFear.com. No more fear from exam. Many times we are confused between direct object and indirect object, and we are unable to identify which one is direct object and which one is indirect. So here this video is dedicated to direct and indirect object so that we get to understand the clue that will help us to identify direct and indirect object. Now, as we all know that in every sentence we have a subject and we have an object. Sometimes we have no object, sometimes we have one object, and sometimes we have more than one object. Now, objects are often part of the predicate in a sentence, right? For example, Ram is a good boy. So, Ram is the subject, is a good boy is the predicate. So, the objects are always included within the predicate, and an object follows the subject and a verb in a sentence. So these are some of the basics which we already know about a subject and an object. Now, what about direct object? Now, when we talk about direct object, it is always the receiver of the action that is performed by the subject, because in any sentence the action is performed by the subject, and the one who receives that action is the direct object. Then what about indirect object? So indirect object is basically the person or thing for whom the action is performed. So I think with these two description of direct and indirect object, most of the things are already clear. So direct object means receiver of the action, indirect object for whom that action has been performed, and subject is the doer of the action. So let us look at this example. My grandmother bought me a ring. So our first task is to identify the action verb. That means the verb which shows that an action is taking place. So here the action verb is bought. So the question is, who bought the ring, or who is the doer of that action? It's the grandmother. So my grandmother is the subject here. Then what about the object? So if you see here, you have two objects, me and ring. Now the question is, which one is a direct object and which one is an indirect object? So let us again do a quick recap of the definition. Who is the receiver of the action? The action here is buying the ring. So what is being bought? The ring is being bought. So that means ring is the direct object, because that who is receiving the action, what is being bought? Bought is the action here. So what is being bought? Ring. And for whom is the ring bought? The ring is bought for me. So me is indirect object. So it's simple, right? But sometimes when you have complex sentences, it becomes difficult to identify direct object and indirect object. So let us focus on the direct object first. Now, whenever it comes to direct object, your clue would be ask the question what or whom. Let's look at this example. Sheila writes a letter. So in this case, which is the action verb? Writes. And who is writing the letter? Sheila. So obviously Sheila is the subject here. Now we will ask a question to identify the direct object. Sheila writes what? And what is the answer to this question? She writes a letter. So this shows that letter is the direct object here. So whenever you ask the question what or whom with the action verb, that is writes what, the answer would be letter. So letter is the direct object. Now, a direct object could be a noun, pronoun, phrase, or clause. For example, in this case, letter is a noun. Now, it is also possible that the direct object is a pronoun or a phrase or a clause. And I'm sure by now all of you know what is a phrase, what is a clause, right? Now, another important thing is a direct object doesn't necessarily need the presence of an indirect object. So you may come across a sentence which doesn't have an object at all. You may come across a sentence which has one object, and if that sentence has only one object, then that has to be the direct object. But whenever you have more than one object, then you have one direct and one indirect object. So that actually means that it is not made mandatory for a direct object to have an indirect object, but it is mandatory for an indirect object to have a direct object. Right? That means direct object can exist alone in a sentence, but indirect object will always exist with the direct object. So I think I'm clear now. Let's look at the next example. Sheila called him. So in this case, what is the action verb? Called. So who is calling? Who is doing the action? Sheila. So Sheila is the subject here. Now let's ask the question. Sheila called whom? So if you ask the question what or whom with the action verb. So if you ask called whom, the answer is him. So that means him is the direct object. And also if you look at in this case, him is a pronoun. So in this case, a pronoun is behaving like a direct object. Let's look at the third example. Students hate when the teacher yawns in the class. So in this example, which is the action verb? Hate. So hate is the action verb, and who is doing that action? Who is hating? Students. So students here is the subject. Now here if we ask a question, students hate what? So the answer would be students hate when the teacher yawns in the class. So this entire thing is a phrase, and here this phrase is behaving like a direct object. So as we have mentioned before, that a direct object could be a noun or a pronoun or a phrase or a clause. So this is one such example where the direct object is a phrase. So it is not just a single word which is a direct object, rather a group of words which behaves like a direct object. Now let us look at indirect object. So how do we identify indirect object? So for that, we have to ask questions like for what, to whom, for whom. So these kind of questions will give you answers which are indirect objects. So let us look at this example. Sheila writes a letter to her father. So in this case, which is the action verb? Writes. Who is writing the letter? Sheila. So Sheila is the subject here. Now since we are talking about indirect object now, it is very obvious that the sentence also has a direct object, because indirect object cannot exist alone. So there has to be a direct object. So let us first try to identify the direct object. So if we ask a question with what or whom after the action verb, the question would be Sheila writes what? And the answer would be a letter. That means letter is the direct object in this case, right? Now let us ask the question for indirect object, that Sheila writes a letter for whom or to whom? And then the answer would be to her father. So to her father is an indirect object. Right? So in this fashion, we can identify which one is direct object and which one is indirect object. Now an indirect object could be a noun or a pronoun. Like in case of direct object, even a phrase or a clause could be a direct object. That is not the case with indirect object. Only a noun or a pronoun could be an indirect object. Okay, now let us look at another example. Kriti ate sandwich for breakfast today. So in this case, which is the action verb? Ate, to eat, that's the action verb. And who is doing that action? Kriti. So it's quite obvious that Kriti is the subject here. Now let us ask a question to find out direct object. Now if I ask a question, Kriti ate what? The answer would be sandwich, which shows that sandwich is the direct object. Now what about indirect object? So if we ask, Kriti ate sandwich for what? So if you ask the question for what, then the answer would be breakfast. So breakfast is the indirect object. It's not difficult at all. So you just need to remember what question do you need to ask to find out direct object and indirect object. Let's look at the next example. Raghunath bought his son a car. In this case, which is the action verb? Bought. And who is buying the car? Raghunath. So Raghunath is the subject here. Let's ask the first question. Raghunath bought what? So answer to what is a car. That means car is direct object. So the car is the direct object. Now please remember one thing, that many a time students feel that Direct object always comes at the end and indirect object comes in between. Sometimes they think that indirect object comes at the end, direct object is in between. So there is no such rule like that. Everything depends on the interpretation or meaning of the sentence. So it is always important, never look at the order of the objects, just focus on these questions. What, whom, for what, to whom. So they will tell you which is direct object and which is indirect. Now here in this case, if you ask the next question that Raghunath bought a car for whom? Or to whom did Raghunath buy a car? So the answer would be his son. So his son is the indirect object. Now there are a few important points to be remembered with regards to direct and indirect object. So the first important point is only action verbs can have direct objects. Now this is very, very important. Now the moment I take this example, it will be clear to you. Let's say that if you have a sentence, the kid was happy to get a chocolate. So in this case, let us try to locate the verbs. Was is a verb, get is also a verb. Now if you look at this was, what is was? Is it an action verb? No. This is a linking verb. Why? Because was doesn't show any action that is taking place. It is just trying to link other words to make the sentence meaningful. So is, was, am, were, has, have, these are all linking verbs and not action verbs. Now when we talk about direct objects, we are basically talking about the action verbs. So whenever we say that you have to ask a question what or whom, along with an action verb. So it is always an action verb that we are referring to. So in this case, let us say, for example, if you ask a question, the kid was what? The answer would be happy. So does that mean that happy is direct object here? No, happy is not direct object. Why? Because the question that you are asking is with the linking verb and not with the action verb. So then which is the object here? So you have to ask a question with the action verb. The action verb here is get. So getting something, that means something is happening, some action is happening. So if you ask a question, the kid was happy to get what? The answer would be chocolate. That means chocolate is the direct object here. So it is very important that whenever you ask the question for direct object, that question what or whom must be followed by an action, must follow an action verb and not a linking verb. So that's the first thing. Now the second question is, okay, if that is the case, in that case, what is happy? What is the role of the word happy in this sentence? Because you mean to say that the kid here is the subject, chocolate is the object. Then what about happy? So happy in this case is the subject complement. Now again, you must be asking, what is subject complement? So subject complement is a word that follows a linking verb and it completes the subject by describing it. So a subject complement always describes the subject. That means it adds meaning to the subject. It adds more meaning to the subject. So in this case, if you see, it tells you that the kid was happy. So it tells you how the kid was. The kid was happy to get what? To get a chocolate. So chocolate here is direct object, kid is the subject, and happy is the subject complement because it is describing how the subject is or how the kid is. Right? So I hope it is clear. So sometimes students confuse subject complement and direct object. So there should be no confusion after this. Okay. So now let us look at the next important point. Do not confuse an object with an object complement. Now that is again equally important. Let us look at this example. Now the way we have subject complement which describes the subject, similarly you sometimes have words that describes the object and that therefore they are called object complement. Let's look at this example. He named the boy Rohit. Right? So here which is the action verb? Named, because he is doing something. He is naming someone. So name is the action verb. And who is naming? He. So he is the subject. Now let us ask a question to find out direct object. He named what? Or he named whom? So if you ask the question, he named whom, then what would be the answer? The answer for the whom would be the boy. So the boy here is the direct object. So he named whom? He named the boy. Now, the more important part is, then what is Rohit? Because sometimes you may look at it in this way, that he named the boy what? And the answer is Rohit. So Rohit should be the direct object. But that's not correct. Why? Because whenever we have to identify direct object, we have to ask a question, what or whom, after the action verb. And the action verb in this case is named. So the question has to be, he named whom? Correct? So the answer will be, he named the boy. So the boy is the direct object here. Then what is Rohit? Rohit here is the object complement. That means Rohit is describing the object. It is telling what is the name of that boy. It is telling the specific name of that boy is Rohit. So it is describing the object further. So it is object complement and not the object. Let's take one more example. They selected him their captain. So here, which is the action verb? Selected. Now, who is doing the selection? They. So they is the subject here. So if you ask a question, they selected whom? The answer would be him. So him is the direct object. And what is their captain? So their captain again is the object complement in this case, which is describing the object further. It is telling that him is basically who? Him has been selected. He has been selected as their captain. So their captain is the object complement. Next important point. Subjective pronouns are never used as direct objects. So you must be thinking, what are subjective pronouns? All those pronouns which are used as subject in a sentence. For example, he, she, they, I, you. So these are I, we. These are all examples of subjective pronouns. Why? Because all these forms of pronouns are always used as subject. Now it is quite obvious that if they are used as subject in a sentence, so they cannot be the object, right? So therefore these subjective pronouns are never used as direct objects. So if you look at this example, she called him using a secret code. So which is the action verb here? Called. And who is calling? She. So obviously she is the subject here. And she called whom? The answer would be him. So him is the direct object here. So you see, him is a pronoun, but it is the objective pronoun or the objective form of a pronoun. So for example, him, her, them, me, us, all these can be used as direct objects because these are all objective pronouns. Now let us look at one more example. When I met Reena, she called him using a secret code. So in this case, which one is the direct object? So there are different ways of asking questions. So in this case, if you think that, okay, now she is in the middle of the sentence, so she should be the direct object, but that's not the case. First, you have to ask the question, where is the action verb? So you have one action verb here, you have one action verb here. So you actually have two action verbs. So let us try to ask the question with the action verbs. When I met whom? Reena. So Reena is the object here. Similarly, if you ask, she called whom? She called him. So him is the object here. So in this case, Reena and him are the objects and I and she are behaving like subjects. So therefore, the subjective pronouns like I, he, she, they, we, they can never behave like direct objects. So I hope that with this, you have understood what is a direct object, what is an indirect object, and how do we identify these objects in a sentence. So these rules are extremely important because while learning about cases like noun cases, pronoun cases, or even direct indirect speech, active passive voice, tenses, you need knowledge of direct indirect object. So please understand these rules very carefully. Try to do some practice or practice some exercises. Try to use this while you speak English, so that is going to help you. So I hope you found this lesson useful. See you soon with a new lesson on a new topic. Thank you. Please visit examfear.com for free quality education. You can learn with a simple 4-step learning process wherein you can watch video lessons, you can ask your questions, you can refer notes, and you can take a free online test. We have content for class 6 to 12 on physics, chemistry, mathematics, and biology along with practical videos. So please subscribe to our channel for daily updates. Thank you.